Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful evening. We're almost at our winter solstice, so I know it got dark early. I am Mindy Craig with Blue Point Planning, and I am working with the County of Santa Clara as part of the team for developing the climate roadmap. And I will be helping to facilitate tonight. And I also want to just give a heads up to several other people on our team. From Blue Point also is Yemi Rivas-Reyes, who will also be watching the chat throughout tonight, helping out with any technical issues. So if you have a question or something like that, pop it in the chat and she will help you out. We have Alyssa Jared, who is here with Rincon Consulting, and you will hear from her and give us some of the technical details on the plan. And then Brianne Boyle, who is here as a project manager from the County of Santa Clara. So you will also be hearing a lot from Brianne as we go forward. Just a couple little housekeeping items before we jump in. Also, please make sure to keep yourself on mute. We appreciate that so we don't hear the cats and the dogs. And again, use that chat. That's a little bubble that should be at the bottom of your thing for questions in Elements. We will be recording tonight, as you probably saw. This will go up onto the website. So those who are not able to join us tonight will also be able to hear the presentation and learn more about that. We'll be doing a bunch of different interactive elements tonight. So keep an eye out for what those are. There'll be links that are going to be dropped into the chat. So you'll be able to click on those to join in some voting and also in another interactive activity. We're going to hold our questions until after the presentation. So if you have a hot one, obviously put that in the chat and we'll come back to it. We'll just give a pause at that moment. So let me go ahead and give us a little overview of our agenda. So tonight is really a really important part of the CAPS development. We've done a lot of work with the county so far, a lot of stakeholder engagement, as well as a lot of technical work. So we're going to give you an overview of some of that material, what we've been doing, give you a heads up on what the vision and goals have been drafted, and give you a chance to actually respond to some of the elements of it, make sure that works for you. And then we're really spending most of our night tonight talking about the initial strategies for the roadmap. You're going to have a chance to learn about those, but also help us understand what are some of the key issues around equity, because this roadmap really is being centered in equity. And it also helps us just think about how we create better and stronger strategies to put the county on the right path forward. And then we'll finally finish up with a timeline and next steps. So I'm going to go and start off by having Brianne with the county start us off. So Brianne.
Thank you, Mindy. So for those of you that missed it, I'm Brianne Boyle. I'm a management analyst with the County of Santa Clara's Office of Sustainability, and I'm leading the roadmap development process. Next slide. So what is the climate roadmap? The climate roadmap is a plan that the county is going to use to promote a healthy environment, a vibrant economy, and social equity. And we know that many of the cities in the county already have their own climate action plans and their own goals. So the roadmap will really serve as a plan to prioritize action in those unincorporated county areas, and then also to help facilitate regional partnerships to further encourage sustainable communities across our county. So we'll go into detail on the phases of the process that you see on the screen here, but just to give a quick overview, we really started the process of developing the roadmap by conducting a community greenhouse gas emissions inventory and by setting targets. And then we also set a vision and goals, considering the input that we heard from the community and their needs. So all of those things, the vision and goals and the inventory and targets, helped us develop draft emissions reduction strategies. And those strategies will be refined based on stakeholder feedback, things we hear tonight, things we hear in the future, by evaluating the equity impacts of each strategy against what we're calling equity guardrails, and we'll go into detail on those in a little bit. And then also other community engagement opportunities. And so after another round of community engagement, we'll update those strategies, and we will have a final set that we'll include in the county's Roadmap 2030. Next slide. So there's three overarching phases of the project, as you can see here. The initial phase was really focused on stakeholder education and awareness, learning what the problems were and what issues the project should address. And then concurrently, we developed the emissions inventory and forecast. The second phase of the project really focused on engaging stakeholders and understanding what the possible strategies could be to reduce emissions and to help work towards a healthier community. And we're still in that phase of the process. And then the last phase, that will focus on identifying priorities, roles, and funding for some of these strategies, and to help empower stakeholders to support and in some cases lead implementation of the solutions that we come up with. And so phase one is completed. As I mentioned, we're in the middle of phase two to develop the strategies, and we're aiming to complete the roadmap in mid-2022. Next slide. So greenhouse gas emissions inventory, what you're seeing here, that provides a baseline data point for the county to understand what our main sources of greenhouse gases are now, what our existing conditions are. And this can help inform the county and our partners of where we should focus these strategies and the priorities on. So we have completed the emissions inventory both for countywide, which is the figure you see on the left, and then for the unincorporated areas, which is what you see on the right, using data from 2017. And I'll highlight just a couple key points. First, you'll note that unincorporated emissions make up just 3% of the countywide emissions, so it is a small portion. Countywide, the biggest source of emissions is from on-road transportation. However, in unincorporated county, the biggest source of emissions is from natural gas in buildings. And then you'll see here that electricity was also a contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in 2017, but the emissions from electricity have declined since 2017, and they will continue to decline due to the work of Silicon Valley Clean Energy, our clean energy provider. Next slide. So right now the county is in the process of setting targets for 2030 and 2035, and that's what you'll see on this figure here. And I'll walk you through it. So the first line, that gray line, that's the level of 2017 emissions, just carried out into the future. The business as usual forecast, that's a dark blue line on the top, and that shows what will happen if the county doesn't implement any sort of climate programs. The adjusted forecast in light blue, that takes into account statewide planned programs, including programs around energy, improvements in building codes and standards, and then transportation electrification elements. And then lastly, the area in orange, that indicates the level of emissions that need to be reduced by the county and our partners in order to meet the targets that we've established. And so the county is planning on establishing an aggressive target of carbon neutrality by 2035. And we understand it will be very challenging to meet that target, but we know we need to take urgent action to reduce greenhouse gases and limit the impacts we're seeing from climate change. And being bold can help us get there faster. We also know that a lot could change before 2035, and our hope is that there's new technologies and new approaches that have been developed by then that will help us meet that goal. Next slide. So just to reiterate, carbon neutrality by 2035, that means reducing greenhouse gas emissions as close to zero as possible and offsetting the rest through things like planting trees or expanding and maintaining green space through carbon sequestration. So we know that getting to zero means reducing fossil fuel usage in every sector that you see here: buildings, transportation, waste, water, and agriculture, no matter how small the emissions might be. Next. Now we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about the roadmap, vision, and goals. Next slide. To help us develop a vision and goals for the roadmap, we used a virtual visioning wall, which is what you see on the slide here. And that helped us get feedback from community members on their vision for a climate-friendly Santa Clara County. And we received over 100 comments on topics ranging from things like electric vehicles and public transportation to topics like sustainable food choices. Next slide. And the feedback that we received on that visioning wall, that helped us build our vision for the roadmap. And you see our vision on the screen here. Our vision is to ensure a healthy, equitable, prosperous, and climate-friendly Santa Clara County through regional climate collaboration and robust action. Next slide. We also use the feedback that we received on the vision wall to develop goals for the roadmap. And we have 5 goals that we've listed here. They're related to all electric, efficient, and resilient buildings, housing affordability, transportation that is safe, reliable, and low emissions, supporting and maintaining our natural environment, and transitioning to good jobs and a green economy. And so I'll pause for just a second so you can kind of skim through the goals yourself.
And then we're going to have an opportunity for all of us to sort of give a sort of how comfortable we are with each of these goals. And so I'm going to move us maybe to the next slide, if that you're okay, Brianne.
Yeah, there's just one more thing I wanted to emphasize,
Yeah, sure.
one takeaway here. We know that it's critical not only to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and build resilience, but also to support and sustain and enhance our natural resources, our health and well-being, and our economy. So just a key point that while greenhouse gas emissions are important, there's other elements that are important as well. And so I'll turn it over to you, Mindy, and we can start the activity.
Great. I'm going to turn it over to Alyssa and talk about roadmap strategies and equity, because I think this is, again, where you'll see some of that more specific information.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Alyssa Jared. I am a greenhouse gas analyst, and I work with Rincon Consultants, and we're supporting the county on this roadmap project. So now that we've talked through the vision and the goals for the roadmap, we can start to discuss the county's actual strategies for achieving the climate action targets. So the strategies are the way that the county will make both the unincorporated county and the county as a whole more sustainable, and they will make up the bulk of the roadmap. So I'll talk about the county's plan for developing these strategies so that they are both impactful and realistic. And I'll also talk about how the county plans to ensure the roadmap strategies are equitable. So you can go to the next slide. All right, so this slide shows the key pillars that guide the development of the roadmap strategies. And each roadmap strategy is required to address each of the key pillars. And this helps make sure that the roadmap strategies, like I said before, are impactful and realistic. So the key pillars are to enact structural change, gather information, design funding for cost effectiveness, collaborate regionally, and engage and empower. So just as an example, a viable roadmap strategy to support higher electric vehicle adoption rates might include a feasibility study that identifies ideal locations for new public charger installations, and that would address the gather information pillar. And it might also include a community electric vehicle engagement plan to address the engage and empower pillar. And it might also include an enforceable new policy, like a requirement for new development to install EV charging spaces and parking lots, and that would address the structural change pillar. So that should give you an idea of how we're using the key pillars to craft these strategies. You can go to the next slide. The other piece of how the strategies are crafted is through the equity guardrails. So the county has identified equity as really an important part of the roadmap. And this slide shows the equity guardrails, which are the main mechanism the county will use to make sure that the roadmap strategies are equitable. Equity guardrails are sort of like criteria which each roadmap strategy needs to meet to be considered equitable. So I'll just read through the guardrails, also give you a second to read through them as well. The guardrails are to prioritize marginalized community access to economic, health, safety, and comfort benefits, design funding, financing, and high road job opportunities to be accessible to marginalized communities, add and expand programs for marginalized communities in partnership with CBOs to educate, engage, provide resources, and respond to barriers, protect marginalized communities from displacement and increased cost of living, and then also continue investment with and engagement of marginalized communities as the roadmap is implemented. So the process for using each of these guardrails involves evaluating each proposed roadmap strategy against the equity guardrails to determine where there might be gaps in the strategy approach. So I'll give you an example. A strategy like our previous example to support higher electric vehicle adoption rates, which only requires EV charger installation for new development, would not by itself pass the criteria to prioritize marginalized community access to these benefits. the first equity guardrail at the top. And that's because it might still be difficult for low-income residents to afford electric vehicles, even if more chargers are available. So one solution might be to support electric car share in multifamily housing or in the communities of unincorporated Santa Clara County to make these electric vehicles more accessible. And adding this solution to the roadmap strategy would help it to pass the equity guardrail criteria. So we can go to the next slide. So at this point, I'll go through the draft list of roadmap strategies that the county has identified so far. These draft strategies were identified as important for moving the unincorporated county towards carbon neutrality by 2035. And this slide shows the roadmap strategies for buildings and energy in unincorporated county. And they include 100% carbon-free electricity, electrification of all new buildings, retrofitting existing buildings to use 100% electricity, improving energy efficiency, and expanding renewable energy and storage. And I also just want to note in this slide, you can see the figure to the right. This is a capture of the unincorporated county's greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see that natural gas and electricity really make up the bulk of the unincorporated county's emissions. So these strategies would all be addressing the emissions in those two categories. So we can go to the next slide. So the roadmap strategies for making transportation in the unincorporated county more sustainable include building infrastructure to promote active transportation. I think somebody noted that as a priority earlier in the exercise. Also providing zero emission vehicle infrastructure like EV chargers, and then also decarbonizing off-road equipment so that they run on electric, hydrogen, and biofuels. And you can see in the little graphic at the right that this addresses another sliver of the greenhouse gas emissions in the unincorporated county. Go to the next slide. The roadmap strategies for making waste systems in the unincorporated county more sustainable include providing curbside compost pickup to all residential and commercial customers by 2022, coordinating county-level organics composting and edible food recovery, and also leveraging agricultural compost application to meet SB 1383 requirements and sequester carbon. Just to note that SB 1383 is a state legislation about waste, so the county aims to meet the requirements of that state legislation. You can see that waste is, although a smaller part of emissions in unincorporated counties, still contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. You can go to the next slide. So the roadmap strategies for making water and wastewater more sustainable include increasing water use efficiency across the county, and also coordinating with wastewater treatment plants to capture and reduce wastewater emissions. And I'll note that water and wastewater are a pretty small source of greenhouse gas emissions in unincorporated county, but they're really important systems to consider when we're talking about making operations and the community more sustainable. And for that reason are still really important. And then also thinking about the carbon neutrality goal, net zero emissions by 2035, really means reducing as much as possible emissions in all categories, not just the big ones. We can go to the next slide. So the county also wants to include strategies for making agriculture more sustainable. So these strategies that have been drafted so far include supporting farmers in adopting more modern and efficient farming technologies and practices, also improving fertilizer efficiency and enhancing compost use, strategizing with farmers to reduce methane, and also promoting energy efficient farming equipment. Next slide. So lastly, the roadmap contains strategies for increasing carbon sequestration in the unincorporated county. And carbon sequestration involves planting trees or maintaining open spaces so that greenhouse gas emissions are taken out of the atmosphere. And the roadmap strategies for carbon sequestration include procuring and applying recycled organic products like compost throughout unincorporated county lands and agricultural lands, and also leveraging natural working lands to enhance carbon sequestration in the county. Next slide. I think I hand it back to you, Mindy.
That's right. Yeah, thanks, Alyssa. So where does this all fit in what we're doing tonight? So we've introduced our vision and goals, and we've talked about our mission targets and given you a first draft of these strategies. So what we now need to do is to put those strategies to make sure they're equitable. So today we're focusing on, are the big areas, the big theme areas that we've talked about, what are some of the considerations that we need to bake into our plan to make sure that we're talking about equity? And I'm going to talk more about that in a second when we move to our activity itself. But then we'll then refine these and clean them up a little bit and maybe enhance them and get your feedback. And then we're going to give you a chance after that, not too far down the road, to actually then give some detailed input on what those strategies are. And so today, don't feel like I need to change these strategies. That's not what we're really talking about today. What we're really going to talk about is what our equity issues are related to some of these things, because what we know is that climate and equity are very, very closely aligned here. So fantastic feedback and really will be valuable as we move forward. I am going to move us to our next thing, because we're just kind of moving to the end of it, and switch back to sort of what are those next steps. So let me go ahead and back to this process, and then we can have a minute or two for any final questions before we wrap up this evening. Brianne, do you want to take us to the next steps?
Yeah. Thank you, Mindy. And before I talk about next steps, one thing I wanted to make sure I mentioned was that the county did have a recent win. We passed all electric requirements for new buildings, which would apply to all unincorporated county areas. So these are also called REACH codes, if you're familiar with that term, but we're excited that we finally got these passed. So moving on, in terms of our timeline and next steps, what happens next, that Mindy mentioned that we'll use the feedback that we received tonight to refine our strategies. And then once we do have a revised set of strategies, we're going to be using an online tool called Consider It to get further detailed feedback on those strategies. And then we'll take another look and evaluate and prioritize strategies based on a number of factors, including their overall impact, the co-benefits, the cost, and other factors as well. And then another exciting next step we have is we'll be issuing mini grants soon to community organizations to help us target specific audiences and share more information about our climate roadmap and get them involved in the process. And then as a reminder, as we mentioned, we're hoping to complete the roadmap mid next year. And so that's all we have in terms of next steps that we wanted to share. If you want to go to the next slide, Mindy, this has my contact information. If you have any more questions after tonight, you can always email me. And then we also have the project website, and on that website, you can sign up for updates. You can see our detailed emissions inventory and forecast on the website as well. So we have some more information there. But I think since we do have